So getting to know our specification. The junior cycle history specification will come alive in classrooms in September. The vision, the 8 principles, the 8 key skills, and the 24 statements of learning of the 2015 junior cycle framework are distilled into our junior cycle history specification. All subject specifications have the same structure and follow the same headings: strands, elements, and learning outcomes. As subject teachers, we will plan using our subject specifications. They incorporate the core curriculum reforms that put the student at the centre of the learning experience. The new junior cycle history specification on the website of the National Council of Curriculum and Assessment. The specification is designed to be consulted as an online resource, as in time it will outline the expectations for students, which will link learning outcomes with annotated examples of student work in our subject. As teachers, when we view the online specification, we will be able to scroll through the learning outcomes and access samples examples of student work which will exemplify specific learning outcomes or groups of learning outcomes. These will be developed as the students and teachers bring the specification to life in their classrooms. Another support for history teachers is on the history section of the JCT webpage. There you will find the materials from our current CPD day entitled The Nature of Junior Cycle History. That brings us to the key resources we've created to support you for junior cycle history. The key resources we will refer to in the course of this webinar are the Quick Reference Guide. This serves to summarise the strands and elements and learning outcomes from the specification, and an action verb sheet, which is on page 11 of the CPD booklet. In the Quick Reference Guide, in the centre panel of the Quick Reference Guide, you will find the 3 strands of the junior cycle history specification. Each column corresponds to one of the 3 strands. The green strand 2, the history of Ireland, the red strand 1, the nature of history, and blue strand 3, the history of Europe and the wider world. You'll notice that the columns are not in numeric order, and that strand 1 is in the centre of the 3. You may be able to guess why. That is because the nature of history strand is a unifying strand for the specification. It is both unifying and formational. We're going to look at the core focus of the other strands now. The 3 strands, the nature of history. Strand 1, the nature of history, is a unifying and formational strand. It's unifying because it focuses on the nature of history as a discipline, and it emphasises the skills, concepts and values and attitudes that inform the learning of history. It's formational because it helps to form our students as historians, and it should inform and underpin all engagement with the historical personalities and issues and events that students will encounter in the contextual strands 2 and 3. Contextual strand 2 is the history of Ireland. Contextual strand 3 is the history of Europe and the wider world. They are contextual strands in that they provide the historical context, the personalities, issues and events to which learners can apply the conceptual understanding and learning gained through strand 1. Now let's look what our specification says about how learning outcomes are outlined in our strands. The learning outcomes in our strands are numbered according to elements. We're going to talk about elements now in a moment. They're numbered according to strand and then grouped by element. According to the specification, the numbering is intended to support teacher planning in the first instance and does not imply any hierarchy of importance across the outcomes themselves, nor does it suggest an order in which learning outcomes should be developed in class. So if the learning outcomes are grouped in strands and elements, let's see if we can find out a little bit more about the elements. The learning outcomes of each of the 3 strands are categorised into elements. Each element is associated with a range of learning outcomes that set out what the student should know or be able to do following their engagement with the strands. The element provides a lens through which these learning outcomes can be viewed. The elements provide a common theme or core to the learning outcomes in that element. Strand 1, the nature of history, has 3 unique interrelated elements, while the 2 contextual strands have the same 3 elements. They divide historical topics into composite parts of the bigger historical picture. So let's look closer at the elements of Strand 1, the nature of history, and their role in helping us plan units of learning for the new junior cycle in the new junior cycle history specification. So the first interrelated element of Strand 1 is developing an historical consciousness. Each of the elements of Strand 1 have a distinctive purpose. The first is developing a historical consciousness, which helps students see the world and their place in it. The second is working with evidence, which helps students realise that evidence must be the basis for all historical judgments. And finally, this element serves to share with students an overarching framework of the past. So let's look at a learning outcome from each of these elements in Strand 1 to get a grasp of how interrelated and how foundational and formational they are for our students. We're just going to take one from each of the elements to give us a flavour. Now let's look at the remaining 2 contextual strands and their elements. Strand 2 and Strand 3 share a set of elements: recognising key change, exploring people, culture and ideas, and applying historical thinking. These contextual strands relate to the historical context in terms of personalities, issues and events. In Strand 2, the history of Ireland, and in Strand 3, the history of Europe and the wider world. The learning outcomes are grouped by element. I'll give you an opportunity to read there. What makes these elements? What comprises of these elements? The first one, recognising key change. These are big change agents that happen in the course of history. The second is exploring people, culture and ideas. The third is applying historical thinking. We're going to look at the relationship between strands is best explained by looking at examples of learning outcomes from the strands. We're going to look at 3 examples to enhance our awareness of the nature of this relationship. The first exemplifies the relationship between the learning outcomes in the contextual strand and the unifying strand. The second exemplifies the relationship between the learning outcomes in the contextual strand, and the final one, the third, exemplifies the strong relationship between learning outcomes across all 3 strands. It's important to remind yourself that Strand 1 does not equate to a first-year course. Hence the jigsaw. The learning outcomes will be realised while engaging with the historical context of Strands 2 and 3 over 3 years. Students should continually be encountering elements and outcomes from Strand 1 as they cover the content in the contextual Strands 2 and 3. So the relationship between learning outcomes, contextual strand and the unifying strand. The 27 learning outcomes in Strand 2 and 3 are the historical context, the personalities, issues and events with which we hope to engage junior cycle students over the course of 3 years. While engaging with the historical context of these 27 learning outcomes, we are also supporting the students in their development as historians by activating the 11 learning outcomes in Strand 1. We'll look at one example of this interdependent relationship across the contextual and unifying strands now. Between Strand 3, the history of Europe and the wider world, and Strand 1, the nature of history. So, from the contextual strand, we've selected the first learning outcome from Strand 3, Europe and the wider world. 3.1. Investigate the lives of people in one ancient or medieval civilization of their choosing, explaining how the actions and or achievements of that civilization contribute to the history of Europe and or the wider world. When we look at the action verb investigate in this learning outcome, the need for a learning outcome from the nature of history strand becomes clear. How can students conduct an historical investigation of an ancient or medieval civilization without having an understanding of historical sources and evidence? And this led us to the identification of the following learning outcome from Strand 1. 1.6. Debate the usefulness and limitations of different types of primary and secondary sources of historical evidence, such as written, visual, oral, and tactile evidence, and appreciate the contribution of archaeology and new technology to historical inquiry. We will show you how you might develop this relationship further into a unit of learning in the planning section of the webinar. Now let's look at the relationship between learning outcomes across the contextual strands. The learning outcome in the contextual strands, the history of Ireland and the history of Europe and the wider world have a strong relationship. The learning outcomes from Strand 1 from one strand are often mirrored in the other strand, demonstrating to the learner the interconnected nature of history. The historical context, in terms of personalities, issues and events that are encompassed in strand 3, Europe and the wider world, have their impact on those in strand 2, Ireland, and vice versa. The red box in the background is to illustrate that whenever we are engaging with contextual history, we are also engaging with the nature of history. We're going to look at an example of this relationship across the contextual strands and the interconnected relationship between Ireland's history and that of Europe and the wider world. The interrelated nature of Ireland's history and that of Europe and the wider world is exemplified by Learning Outcome 2.3 and Learning Outcome 3.3. Both deal with revolutions and rebellions and are in the same time frame. The historical understanding achieved through engagement with one can enhance and support the historical understanding aspired to in the other. Looking at the nature of history strand, learning outcomes in your quick reference guide, can you identify a formational and unifying learning outcome from the nature of history strand that will provide students with the skills, knowledge and values to engage with an exploration of learning outcome 2.3 and an examination 3.3? Maybe you could post them in the questions box. The final example is a relationship between learning outcomes across the 3 strands. These 3 outcomes are from the applying historical thinking element of the contextual strands and from the acquiring the big picture elements of the nature of history strand. These 3 learning outcomes will be engaged with over the course of 3 years of junior cycle history. So making connections and comparisons, exploring technological developments to innovate historical innovation and change, and making connections between local and personal and family history. They really give us an opportunity to apply historical thinking and to acquire the big picture over the 3 years.